The night had fallen quietly over the medieval countryside, wrapping the fields and forests in a heavy silence. There were no streetlights, no hum of wagons or distant lamps to comfort the darkness. Only the wind, sliding through the cracks of wooden walls, and the soft breathing of those who slept beneath rough wool blankets. For the peasants of medieval Europe, winter was not a season to be admired, but an endless test of patience and endurance. When the world froze outside, they fought not to live in comfort, but simply to stay alive. Inside a small thatched cottage made of mud and straw, a faint orange light flickered across the walls. It came from a single fire, burning low in a stone hearth, guarded carefully by hands that understood how precious it was. The warmth was weak but sacred, a fragile thread tying life to hope. Families gathered close around it, faces glowing red from the heat on one side and pale from the cold on the other. The cottage was simple, built with whatever could be found: sticks, clay, animal dung, and faith. The wind moaned outside like a restless ghost, and every small gap in the wall invited the chill to crawl inside. The peasants fought back with layers of wool, with animal hides nailed over openings, with their own breath and each other's warmth. Matches did not exist, and fire was a treasure. One person in the family always had a holy duty: to keep the flame alive through the night. They would wake again and again, half asleep, to feed a few twigs into the embers. Losing that fire meant misery, for lighting a new one required flint stones that were rare and hard to use. In many villages, if someone's fire died, they would walk through the snow to a neighbor's house, carrying a small clay pot to borrow a spark. A single living flame became a shared heartbeat for an entire community. They learned to guard it with ashes. Before sleeping, the firekeeper would bury the glowing coals under a layer of gray ash, trapping the warmth until morning. At dawn, a single breath would revive it, and the fire would live again. It was a small ritual of survival, repeated every night for centuries. Around that fire, families huddled close: parents, children, even animals. Privacy was a luxury none could afford in winter. They slept together on straw mattresses, wrapped in rough blankets, pressed shoulder to shoulder. Sometimes the chickens were brought inside, sometimes the goat, or even a cow. The animal's breath and body heat made the cottage a little less cruel. It was not affection but necessity that bound them together like this. Yet in that closeness, there was something deeply human, a quiet comfort that came from simply sharing warmth. Outside, the cold ruled everything. The fields were dead, the rivers frozen, the forest silent. Food was scarce, and most peasants lived on what they could store: a few sacks of grain, dried beans, salted meat, and loaves of bread, so hard they had to be dipped in ale or soup to soften. In the corner of the cottage, a pot of stew simmered slowly, made from cabbage, barley, and old bones, boiled again for flavor. The smell filled the room, not delicious, but familiar. It was the scent of survival. Hunger was a constant guest, yet no one complained. They had long accepted that winter took more than it gave. Time moved slowly in those months. The sun vanished before supper, and darkness stretched endlessly. Without clocks, they measured the hours by the dim flame and the rhythm of their chores. Someone would mend a torn tunic, another would sharpen a blade. While the children dozed against their mother's side, half listening to the crackle of the fire. The air inside was thick smoke, sweat, and tallow candles made from animal fat. The peasants' world was small, lit by firelight and faith. Outside their door, the cold waited like a patient enemy. But inside, in the heart of their modest homes, they endured. They did not fight the winter because it was stronger than them. They accepted it, adapted to it, and somehow, through centuries of hardship, learned to find peace in its silence. In the quiet of those nights, as frost gathered on the window and the fire sank into its ashes, the peasants of the medieval world dreamed of spring, a distant, shining promise that kept them alive through the longest, coldest nights. When winter pressed harder and the nights grew longer, the peasants turned to the oldest kind of wisdom, the kind that came not from books, but from generations of survival. Every wall, every stitch, every beam of wood in their small homes told a story of how people learned to live side by side with the cold. The peasants were not engineers or architects in the way we understand them today, but their houses were built with a deep understanding of nature and endurance. The cottages stood low to the ground, squat and humble, their roofs thick with thatch made from reeds or straw. The thatch itself was more than a roof, it was insulation. Thick layers trapped air inside, creating a barrier that kept the warmth in and the frost out. In some places, snow piled over the roofs during winter, but that only made the house warmer, like a natural blanket laid down by the season itself. Inside, the walls were made from a mixture of straw, mud, and animal dung, a material called wattle and daub. To modern minds, it might sound crude, but it was incredibly practical. The mud sealed the gaps, the straw gave strength, and the dung acted as a binder, keeping everything from cracking. When the fire burned, the smoke seeped into the walls, hardening the mixture over time until it became almost like stone. The smell might have been strange at first, but it faded, replaced by the familiar scent of home. Some peasants lined the inside of their walls with tapestries or old cloth, not for decoration, but for insulation. Every small trick counted when the wind found its way through. Their floors were rarely made of wood. Most were just packed earth, beaten flat by years of footsteps. On cold nights, they scattered straw across the floor, a soft layer that trapped warmth and muffled sound. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. In the corners of the room, rough wooden beams supported the roof, darkened by years of smoke. Overhead, bundles of herbs hung from the rafters, drying slowly through the winter months' time. Sage and lavender, collected during the brief summer. When burned or brewed, they offered both medicine and a little comfort. The hearth was the heart of everything. It stood in the center of the main room, a small fire pit made of stone or clay. Around it, life unfolded, meals cooked, clothes dried, and hands warmed. Above the fire, an iron hook or wooden beam held a pot that rarely left its place. Every night, the same stew simmered there, thickened day by day, fed with scraps and leftovers, becoming richer as winter went on. The smoke from the fire didn't always have a chimney to escape through. It filled the room first, rising toward the roof, blackening the beams before slipping out through cracks or the thatch. It stung the eyes, made them water, but it also kept away insects and preserved the wood. The peasants lived inside a smoky haze, but they had grown used to it. it was the scent of survival. Clothing was another layer of armor against the cold. In a time before central heating, what one wore could mean the difference between comfort and suffering. Wool was everything. Sheep were not just food, but warmth, walking on four legs. Every household owned at least one, and the sheared wool was spun and woven into thick garments. The peasants' clothing was rough, often itchy, but strong. They wore long tunics made of coarse wool, with linen underneath, if they could afford it. On their feet, leather shoes or boots were stuffed with straw to hold in heat. In the harshest months, they wrapped their legs in cloth strips called puttees and covered their heads with hoods that doubled as scarves. The wealthy might have furs, but peasants made do with layers, sometimes even wrapping old rags around their hands as makeshift gloves. At night, they took off little. Most slept in their clothes, knowing that the warmth of fabric was too precious to lose. The bed itself was a low wooden frame filled with straw or hay, changed a few times each year to avoid pests. Over it were blankets made of wool or animal hides. Some families even used the hides of old livestock, cured and softened, as thick covers. The weight of these blankets pressed down like a comforting shield against the cold. But peasants were not only practical, they were inventive. They learned to use every resource the land could give them. In villages near forests, pine branches were sometimes placed between the walls and roof to block drafts. In open plains, they built windbreaks from stacked firewood or woven reeds. Even their animals became part of their heating system. Barns were often built right next to their cottages, sharing one wall so the warmth from the livestock would pass through. In some regions, they even built a small pen inside the house itself, keeping goats or pigs close during blizzards. It was not pleasant, but it was survival. Their wisdom extended beyond shelter and clothing. They understood the rhythm of the seasons and prepared carefully. Before winter, every family gathered fuel, not just firewood, which was scarce, but peat from the bogs, dried animal dung, and bundles of sticks. The poorest collected whatever they could find, even dried weeds or old straw. Each piece was stored like treasure, knowing that one cold night could burn through a week's supply. The smell of burning peat or dung was heavy and earthy, but it filled the home with much needed heat. Despite the hardship, life in these months had a certain peace. Work in the fields slowed, and for a few weeks, people rested. They repaired tools, patched clothing, and told stories by the fire. The sound of spinning wheels filled the room as women turned wool into thread. The men carved spoons or mended carts, their hands busy even as the world outside slept. The nights were long, and conversation was slow. Simple talk about crops, neighbors, and prayers for a gentle spring. It was a rhythm older than memory, where each day repeated the last, but somehow felt necessary and whole in these moments. Surrounded by the soft crackle of fire and the smell of smoke, the peasants felt something close to contentment. Their lives were hard, but predictable. The cold taught them humility, and the fire taught them gratitude. Each morning they woke to frost on the walls and their breath hanging in the air. Yet they found comfort in the small things: a bowl of hot soup, a mended glove, a spark that survived till dawn. To modern ears, their world might sound bleak, but for them, it was simply life. Quiet, slow, and endlessly patient, the way winter demanded it to be. When the first gray light of morning crept through the small, frost-covered window, life inside the peasant's cottage began slowly. The fire, buried under a layer of ashes, still glowed faintly. The firekeeper stirred, stretching stiff fingers before kneeling to breathe gently onto the embers. A thin wisp of smoke curled upward, and soon a small orange flame flickered to life. The sound of crackling wood filled the silence, warm and familiar. Around the fire, the family began to stir, children rubbing their eyes, a mother reaching for the kettle, the father pulling on his worn boots. Their movements were slow, steady, and practiced. In the world of medieval peasants, every day was a repetition of the last. Yet every morning carried a quiet sense of relief. Another night survived. Outside, the world was still white and silent. Frost hung on every branch, and the breath of cows and horses rose in soft clouds against the gray sky. The air was sharp enough to sting the lungs, but there was work to do. The peasant's life did not pause for winter. It only changed its rhythm. Fields lay bare, but chores continued, feeding animals, breaking ice for water, chopping wood, and repairing tools. Even children had small tasks, like gathering twigs or fetching water from the well. The well water was painfully cold, and sometimes frozen solid. They would use a metal rod or a heavy stick to break the surface, their hands going numb, their faces red from the cold air. Yet they worked quietly, without complaint. Breakfast was simple, a bowl of pottage, the thick soup that had simmered through the night, made of barley, cabbage, and beans. Sometimes, if they were lucky, a piece of bread was added, soaked in broth to soften it. There was no rush, no noise of clocks or schedules. The meal was eaten slowly, the fire crackling nearby, the sounds of wind and distant crows filling the silence. The peasants spoke little in the morning, saving their breath for the day's work. The cottage was small, but it was also a workshop, a shelter, and a gathering place. During winter, most of life happened indoors. Women spun wool into thread, their fingers moving steadily as the spinning wheel hummed softly. Men repaired harnesses, tools, and wooden furniture, their knives scraping rhythmically against the grain. Even the children helped twisting cords, plucking feathers for bedding, or cleaning out the ashes from the hearth. There was little rest, but there was also little hurry. Time moved gently, like snow drifting past the window. When the sun climbed high, its weak light barely touched the frozen fields. Outside, everything seemed dead, but beneath the frost, life waited. Peasants knew this. They had seen too many winters to lose hope. They walked the boundaries of their land, checked fences, and sometimes gathered firewood from the edge of the forest. The sound of axes echoed faintly through the trees. Snow crunched beneath their boots, and birds, small and hungry, fluttered close, searching for crumbs. The peasants moved carefully, for winter forests were dangerous. Wolves still roamed in some places, and the cold itself was a silent predator. But they went anyway, driven by the simple knowledge that wood and food meant survival. As daylight faded, the village changed again. Smoke rose from every roof, curling lazily into the evening sky. The smell of burning wood and peat hung over the fields, mingling with the scent of cooking stew. Inside each cottage, firelight danced on the walls, and shadows stretched long and soft. Families gathered once more around their hearths, the day's work behind them. Children sat close to their parents, listening to quiet talk, stories of old kings, saints, and faraway wars that had little to do with their own lives. The stories were not told for excitement, but for warmth. Words could fill the silence the way a blanket filled the cold. Sometimes the villagers would gather at the local church, even in winter. The church stood at the heart of every medieval village, its stone walls rising above the cottages. Inside, it was cold, the air heavy with the scent of wax and wood smoke. Yet, to the peasants, it was a place of peace. They prayed not for riches, but for mild weather, for health, and for enough food to last until spring. Faith was their greatest comfort, a kind of warmth that no fire could give. After prayers, they returned home in silence, their breath white in the air, their footsteps crunching on the frozen earth. Nights were long in winter, so long that time itself seemed to stretch and slow. But there was a strange beauty in those hours. When the fire burned low and everyone had gone to sleep, the cottage was wrapped in quiet. Outside, the stars shone cold and bright, and the snow reflected their light like a mirror. Inside, the last glow of embers pulsed gently, casting a faint red shimmer on the walls. Sometimes, the wind would moan across the fields, rattling the door, and the sleeping family would draw closer together. The cold crept through every gap, but so did a deep stillness, a reminder that even in hardship, life continued. And so, winter passed in slow repetition, days of work, nights of rest, and in between, small joys, a warm meal, a new story, a laugh shared by the fire. The peasants lived within a circle of simplicity that modern minds might find unbearable. But in that simplicity lay something enduring. They understood the rhythm of the world, that cold and warmth, hunger and plenty, death and life, all followed one another, like the changing of seasons. The coldest nights taught them patience. The smallest comforts taught them gratitude. Each morning they awoke, stretched their stiff limbs, and faced another day with quiet strength. In their world of frost and fire, survival itself was a kind of faith, steady, humble, and eternal. As winter deepened, the cold was no longer their greatest enemy. It was hunger. The frost that coated the land did more than freeze the ground. It stopped life itself. Fields that once waved with grain now lay buried under snow. The streams that had gurgled through summer meadows were hard and silent, sealed in glassy ice. The peasants, who depended on the soil more than on anything else, faced a long stretch of months when the earth gave them nothing. Each day became a careful balancing act, how to stretch their stores, how to make each crumb, each seed, last just a little longer. Inside the small cottages, the food that had been gathered in autumn was slowly disappearing. The sacks of grain grew lighter, the jars of salt pork fewer, the cheeses smaller with each slice. They counted everything. Every family knew exactly how much remained and how many cold weeks still stood between them and spring. There were no markets overflowing with supplies, no easy trades to make. For most peasants, what they had in December had to feed them until March. The math was cruel, and there was no room for mistakes. Meals became simpler as the days passed. Bread was baked less often because flour was precious. The loaves grew thinner, rougher, made from whatever grains they could grind: rye, barley, sometimes even crushed acorns mixed with meal. They boiled cabbage, onions, and beans together, making pottage, a thick, murky soup that filled the belly, if not the heart. The smell of it hung in every cottage, a constant companion. Some nights they had only broth, or a few roots dug from under the frozen earth. Meat was rare. It had been salted and hung months before, and now it was cut sparingly, a piece boiled into soup for flavor, then taken out and saved for another day. Nothing was wasted. Even bones were boiled again and again until the broth turned thin and pale as water. Yet, in the midst of this quiet struggle, the peasants showed a kind of patience that seems almost unthinkable now. They did not rage against their hunger. They endured it. They saw it as part of the natural order of things, the same way they accepted the rain, the snow, and the endless cycle of life and death. The church told them that suffering on earth was temporary, a trial that led to something better beyond life, and so they bore it with faith and silence. But hunger brought other shadows. Weakness came first, slow and creeping. The body, starved of warmth and food, grew tired easily. Work became harder, and small wounds healed slower. Then came sickness. Coughs began to echo through the cottages at night, dry and endless. Smoke from the fires irritated the lungs, and the dampness in the walls bred cold. There were no doctors in most villages, only old women who knew herbs and prayers. A tea of boiled sage or garlic might be offered, or a poultice of honey spread over a sore. But much of it was hope dressed as medicine. Illness was feared, not only because it brought pain, but because it could spread. A cough from one child could travel through a whole family in days. And yet, the peasants stayed close because warmth and care mattered more than distance. A mother would hold her sick child against her chest, whispering prayers into the dark. The others would tend the fire, stirring the pot, keeping the light alive. In such small ways, they fought the cold, not with strength, but with persistence. When the illness grew worse, the priest might come. He would walk through the snow in his heavy robe, carrying a candle and a small cross. Inside the cottage, he would kneel beside the sick, murmur Latin prayers, and anoint their forehead with oil. It was a quiet ceremony, simple and solemn, and afterward the family would feel a little less afraid. In the world of peasants, death was never far, but neither was faith. They believed that every hardship had meaning, even if they could not see it. On the coldest nights, when the firewood was nearly gone and the last coals glowed weakly in the hearth, families huddled together beneath layers of blankets and prayed for dawn. The darkness seemed heavier then, pressing down on the roof, whispering through the cracks. But the peasants had learned to find comfort even in this. They sang soft hymns or told old folk tales, stories of saints who had survived hunger, of miracles that had happened on the bleakest days. The sound of a human voice, even quiet, could keep despair away. Outside, the village slept beneath snow. The roads were impassable, the fields white and lifeless. Only the sound of the wind moved through the trees. Yet beneath that stillness, life persisted. The seeds of last summer waited patiently in the frozen soil. The animals dozed in their stalls, breathing warmth into the air. Even the peasants themselves carried a kind of stubborn life, a faith that spring would come as it always did. It was not optimism, but certainty, learned over generations. No winter, no matter how cruel, had ever lasted forever, and so each family counted the days by their fires, by the dwindling size of their loaves, by the small victories of staying alive. They endured hunger, illness, and the cold, not because they were strong, but because they knew no other choice. Their lives were tied to the rhythm of nature, the long dark followed by the slow return of light. Every dawn was a promise, every ember a reminder that life, even fragile, could still endure against the vast, uncaring cold. When the hunger and sickness of winter pressed heavily upon them, medieval peasants turned to something that neither frost nor famine could take away: faith. It was woven into their lives as tightly as the wool they wore. Every sound of the church bell that drifted through the frozen air reminded them that beyond their small struggles there was a larger rhythm at work, the rhythm of God's world. To the peasants, the cold and hardship were not punishments, but tests of patience and belief. They did not ask why winter came, for they knew it always had and always would. What mattered was how they faced it, with prayer, with endurance, and with the comfort of each other's company. The village church was often the only stone building for miles, its tower rising above the snow-covered cottages like a silent guardian. Even when the wind howled and snow drifted across the paths, the people gathered there, their breath white in the cold air, their footsteps crunching on the frozen earth. Inside, it was no warmer. The walls were damp, the candles flickered weakly, but there was peace. The sound of a hymn, sung softly by tired voices, echoed through the small space. For a few moments, the peasants forgot the emptiness of their bellies and the ache in their bones. They felt that they were not alone, that someone beyond the sky watched over them. The priest spoke in Latin, a language they did not understand, but the sound of it soothed them. His gestures, his tone, the rise and fall of his voice were enough to bring comfort. When he raised the cross or sprinkled holy water, they bowed their heads, whispering prayers in their own tongue. Each family prayed for something simple: a mild thaw, a healthy child, enough grain to last until the thaw. They believed their faith could move the unseen forces that governed their world. And in a way, it did. Hope itself was a kind of warmth. Faith was not confined to the church. It filled their homes in small ways. A carved cross hung above the door, a candle lit beside a simple wooden statue of the Virgin Mary, prayers murmured before sleep. Before every meal, no matter how poor, they bowed their heads in gratitude. Even a bowl of thin soup felt like a gift when given through faith. When someone fell ill, they prayed as they worked, whispering pleas for mercy with each turn of the spinning wheel or each swing of the axe. Prayer and labor were one and the same, both offered with humility. But faith was more than religion. It was the bond that held the village together. When one family ran out of food, others shared what they could, even if it meant going hungry themselves. A few handfuls of grain, a small loaf of bread, a portion of dried beans. These gestures meant survival. In the depth of winter, generosity became a kind of worship. The peasants understood that no one survived alone. When a man fell sick, his neighbors chopped his wood. When a woman lost her husband, the other families gathered to repair her roof. They needed one another, the way their cottages needed the fire. There were also old customs, quiet traditions that had survived from before Christianity. rooted in the ancient relationship between people and nature. On the coldest nights, some villagers left a small piece of bread or a bowl of milk near the hearth, an offering for the spirits of the land or for ancestors watching over them. They didn't call it superstition. It was respect, a way to keep balance with the unseen. These small acts brought comfort, the feeling that even in the endless dark, something kind and invisible shared their struggle. When the nights grew longest, they marked special days, midwinter feasts, simple but sacred. There might be music made from handmade flutes or a drum carved from wood and hide. Someone would tell an old story, the kind that had been told for centuries, stories of the first fire, of saints who had braved snow to help the poor, of ancient winters that had ended in golden spring. The flicker of firelight danced on faces worn by cold and work, and for a few hours, laughter returned. Even the smallest celebration reminded them that winter, no matter how harsh, could not take away their humanity. As the months went on, they began to see signs faint, almost invisible, that the season was turning. The days grew a little longer, the snow softened underfoot, and the wind lost its sharp edge. They noticed the first drops of water falling from the eaves, the sound of ravens calling louder in the sky. Hope stirred again, quietly but surely. The peasants did not speak of spring that would be tempting fate, but they felt it deep in their bones. The hardest part of the year was passing, and their faith had carried them through. Inside the cottage, the fire still burned low, but the light felt different. The same walls that had seemed so small and dark in December now glowed gently with warmth. The same faces, lined and tired, smiled a little more easily. It was not joy as we know it, but something steadier, the peace that comes from endurance. They had faced the cold, the hunger, and the sickness, and still life went on. To the medieval peasant, that was enough in their prayers that night. They simply gave thanks for warmth, for life, for one another, and for the faith that had been their light in the dark. Outside, the wind carried their whispered words across the frozen fields, where soon, beneath the thawing soil, the seeds of spring were waiting to rise again. The hardest weeks of winter were often the quietest. The nights stretched endlessly, and time itself seemed to slow beneath the weight of the snow. Yet, even in this stillness, life stirred beneath the surface of things. The peasants did not see it, but they felt it, a soft change in the wind, a different smell in the air, as if the world was inhaling again after months of holding its breath. It was subtle, almost secret. One morning, the frost on the window looked thinner. The smoke from the chimney rose straighter, and the crows' cries carried farther. Those were the first signs, and the peasants knew how to read them. The days after Midland were restless ones. The peasants' bodies were thinner, their faces pale, but a spark returned to their movements. They spoke more, even laughed quietly as they went about their chores. The fire still burned, but the doors were opened more often, letting in sharp air that no longer stung so deeply. Children, wrapped in patched wool, ventured outside to press their hands into the melting snow. Water trickled from the eaves and ran in thin streams along the frozen paths. To anyone else, it was only thawing ice, but to the villagers, it was the music of promise as the ground softened. Work began again in small, careful ways. The men tested the soil, pressing their boots into the mud, feeling how deep the frost still held. They patched their plows, mended the wooden handles, and sharpened iron blades, dulled by months of rest. The women sorted the seeds that had been saved from the last harvest: barley, rye, peas, beans, checking which had survived the cold and which had spoiled. Each seed was a hope, and they treated them as such, with care bordering on reverence. Children helped by carrying baskets or gathering straw to line the storage bins. It was the rhythm of life returning, slow but certain. Before the first plowing, the village gathered for blessing. The priest, wrapped in a heavy cloak, walked to the edge of the fields with a small group following behind. He carried a bowl of holy water and a sprig of evergreen. As he sprinkled the ground, he prayed in a voice barely above a whisper, asking for fertile soil and gentle weather. The people bowed their heads, some crossing themselves, others silently mouthing their own wishes. It was both ritual and reassurance. The peasants knew that their survival depended on what this soil would give them. But the ceremony made them feel as though their effort was joined with something divine. The first true thaw came suddenly. One morning, the world woke, dripping and alive. Snow slid from the rooftops with heavy thuds. The river cracked and began to move again, carrying shards of ice downstream. Birds that had vanished since autumn returned with cries that sounded almost joyful. The villagers opened their shutters wide, and the scent of damp earth filled every home. After months of cold smoke and stale air, the smell of mud was glorious. It meant life. But spring did not erase hardship immediately. Food stores were at their lowest now. Many families had little left, perhaps a handful of barley, a few onions, or a crust of dried bread. They called this period the hungry gap. It was the cruelest irony. Just when the sun returned and the fields began to promise abundance, the cupboards were bare. To survive these weeks, the peasants foraged for early greens, nettles, wild garlic, dandelion leaves. They boiled them into soups that were thin but full of hope. Sometimes they trapped small birds or fished through cracks in the ice for a meager catch. Every mouthful mattered. In these days, the village became closer still. People shared what little they had. If one household still had flour, they baked bread for several families. If another had honey left from the summer hives, it was divided among children. They had no choice but to care for one another. The line between survival and loss was too thin. When someone found mushrooms or berries early in the forest, they brought them back proudly, and the neighbors gathered to see. Small triumphs were celebrated like festivals. The social rhythm of spring carried not only work, but also renewed friendship. After months indoors, the peasants visited again, walking the muddy paths that connected their cottages. They exchanged stories of the winter, who had fallen ill, who had recovered, who had seen strange lights over the hills or heard wolves in the woods. These tales became part of the season's memory, half truth, half legend, told around the hearth as laughter replaced the long silence of winter nights. With the warming days came chores that filled every waking hour. Men and women worked side by side in the fields, turning soil dark and fragrant. The children chased the oxen, slowly pulling the plows, their shouts echoing across the valley. In the village square, the sound of hammering returned, carts repaired, fences mended, tools reforged. The blacksmith's forge glowed again, sparks flying like fireflies. The air was busy, alive, humming with effort. The people were thin and weary, but they moved with purpose, driven by the knowledge that every furrow and every seed meant food for the next winter. As evening came, the cottages filled with softer sounds, the hiss of water boiling, the rhythmic clack of a loom, a lullaby sung to a sleepy child. The smoke from the chimneys rose in straight, silver threads against the fading sky. Inside, the families ate what little they had, but there was more conversation now, more warmth that did not come only from the fire. The fear of winter had loosened its hold. Even the animals seemed to sense the change. Cows gave milk again, hens began to lay, and the sheep were sheared for the first time in months. The wool, warm and oily, was washed and spread to dry in the sunlight. The women spun it into thread as they sat by open doors, the sound of spinning wheels blending with birdsong. It was humble, ordinary work, yet it carried a quiet beauty, the return of motion, of sound, of life in every direction. When the first flowers appeared, snowdrops and violets, near the churchyard wall, people paused to look. They spoke of them the way one might speak of miracles. For a few weeks, the village smelled of damp earth, new grass, and smoke from fields being cleared. Children brought the small blossoms home and placed them beside icons of saints. Even those who were too tired to smile felt a lightness they had not known for months. At night, under a sky that was once again full of stars, the villagers gathered outside. The air was still cold but gentle, and for the first time they could stand in it without shivering. They talked of the planting to come, of weddings delayed by the snow, of debts to settle, and of the feast they would hold when the first harvest came. Someone played a simple tune on a flute, and a few began to dance. The laughter was small, hesitant at first, but it spread until even the oldest joined in, clapping softly to the rhythm. For that moment, the long darkness of winter felt far away, like a dream fading with dawn. Spring did not erase hardship, but it gave meaning to the suffering that came before. The peasants understood this better than anyone. Their lives were a circle, turning endlessly through cold and warmth, hunger and harvest. They did not hope for an easy life. They hoped only for the strength to meet each season as it came. That strength, earned through patience, was their quiet triumph. And when they lay down to sleep on those early spring nights, they listened not to the silence of frost, but to the soft dripping of water from the roof, to the distant call of owls, and to the faint stirring of wind through branches newly freed of snow. It was the sound of life beginning again, the world waking gently from its long rest. When spring at last unfurled its green fingers across the gray fields, the peasants felt as though the world had been remade. The air itself seemed different, lighter, scented with wet soil and the faint sweetness of blossoms that crept cautiously from the hedgerows. For months they had lived within the hush of winter, where even sound felt muffled by snow. Now the world began to speak again. The babble of brooks, freed from ice, the bleating of lambs in distant meadows, the thud of boots on soft ground. Each noise reminded them that life, though battered, had endured. The first days of true warmth brought work so intense that idleness became impossible. The peasants rose before dawn, when the sky was still a pale gray mist above the fields, and they did not rest until the stars returned. Yet there was joy in this exhaustion. Every spade thrust, Every handful of seed scattered into the damp earth felt like a prayer answered. After months of waiting, their bodies could finally move, stretch, and labor beneath the open sky again. Plowing was the first great ritual of spring. Teams of oxen trudged slowly through the furrows, while men guided the heavy wooden plows, mud clinging to their boots. Women followed behind, casting seed from woven baskets, their motions practiced and rhythmic. Children ran at the edges, chasing crows that swooped to steal the grain. It was a scene repeated for centuries, the great choreography of survival, performed by generations who understood the weight of each handful of soil after the fields were sown. The rhythm of the village changed. Life was no longer confined to the hearth. It spread outward into the sun. Laundry hung on hedges to dry, gleaming white in the light. Wool was washed and combed beside the stream. Chickens wandered freely, scratching at the thawed ground. The peasants' faces, once pale and hollow, began to color again under the sun's steady warmth. Even laughter, rare in the cold months, returned like birdsong. The diet changed too, though supplies were still scarce. New plants offered variety. Peasants gathered wild herbs, sorrel, mint, and sweet cicely to flavor their stews. They ate nettle soup thickened with barley, and later in the season, the first tender vegetables from their gardens, leeks, onions, and turnips. Honey, saved from the previous summer, was brought out for festivals. Meals that had been gray and thin now glowed with green and gold. The taste of life itself returning to their tongues. As the world brightened, so did their spirits. Holy days became opportunities for community. The feast of Easter was the grandest of all, a celebration not just of faith, but of the land's rebirth. On that morning, villagers gathered in their best garments, patched but carefully washed. The church bells rang through the valley, echoing over the fields. Inside, the candles blazed brighter than at any other time of year. The priest spoke of resurrection, of light conquering darkness. And though his Latin words were strange to most ears, everyone understood. They had lived their own resurrection, rising from the tomb of winter into the warmth of spring. After the Mass, there were small feasts held in the open air. Wooden tables were set up, bread broken and shared, jugs of ale passed from hand to hand. Children played chase among the budding trees, while the elders watched with smiles softened by memory. The peasants' laughter mingled with birdsong, and for one day, hunger and worry seemed far away. In the evening, when the sky turned rose and gold, they lit a great fire in the village center, a bonfire of renewal. Sparks flew upward like stars, and people danced around it, slow and clumsy, but full of life beyond the joy. However, there was endless labor to be done. Spring was merciful in beauty, but ruthless in demand. Fences needed mending, roofs repairing after snow, and tools reforged by the blacksmith's steady hand. Sheep had to be sheared before the heat grew, and their wool cleaned and spun. Women spent long hours at the spinning wheels, their feet tapping softly on the floorboards. Men cleared the irrigation ditches that fed the meadows. The village rang with the sounds of effort, hammering, sawing, the thud of mallets, the hiss of boiling dye vats. In this season of growth, courtships blossomed as well. Young men who had scarcely looked up during the hard winter now found reasons to visit the well where the young women gathered water. There were glances exchanged, shy laughter, the plucking of wildflowers to tuck into hair. A promise of marriage was not made lightly. It required the consent of families, the approval of the Lord, and the certainty that both could manage a household. But love, like spring itself, cared little for permission. Beneath the softening skies, hearts quickened with the same energy that stirred the fields. For the children, spring was magic. They followed lambs through the grass, built tiny dams in the streams, and collected eggs hidden in straw. The world was an endless playground. At dusk, when mothers called them home, they came running, with cheeks flushed, hands muddy, and pockets full of pebbles or feathers. Inside, the cottages glowed with firelight and the smell of stew. Family life, once silent and weary, became gentle and full of talk again. Stories were told, songs hummed, and old tales of winter monsters gave way to legends of heroes and saints. The forests, once menacing in their winter silence, became friendly again. Men ventured in to cut timber for new carts, while women gathered herbs for medicine, comfrey for wounds, yarrow for fevers, thyme for coughs. Bees returned to the hives, their low hum a song of promise. Hunters set snares for rabbits, and sometimes, when luck was kind, a deer was brought back to the village. Such meat was rare and precious, and its scent drew neighbors to the door. Even the poorest shared a taste. As the season deepened, festivals marked the passing of time. May Day arrived with garlands of flowers and ribbons tied to a tall pole in the village square. People danced, their movements slow and circular, a ritual older than memory. It was a celebration of fertility, of earth, of animals, of people. The Lord's steward sometimes watched from a distance, amused but tolerant. For one day, work was forgotten, and the peasants let laughter replace labor. Music from fiddles and pipes echoed across the fields, blending with the buzzing of bees and the rustle of new leaves. Spring also brought trade. Peddlers appeared on the muddy roads, carrying goods from distant towns, salt, spices, bright cloth, iron nails, and even tiny mirrors that made children gasp with wonder. The villagers bartered eggs, wool, and cheese for these small luxuries. News traveled with the traders, rumors of wars far away, of kings and popes, of strange lands beyond the sea. To the peasants, these stories felt unreal, like tales from another world. Their own universe was bounded by the fields and forests they knew so well, and they were content with it. There were hardships still. Rains sometimes came too hard, flooding the lowlands and drowning the young crops. Wind could tear thatch from roofs, and sickness could strike even in sunshine. Yet the peasants had learned to bend, not break. When disaster came, they worked together, rebuilding walls, replanting fields, nursing the ill. The memory of winter's endurance made every challenge seem survivable. The land had tested them and found them worthy. As the weeks passed, the landscape transformed completely. The once bare trees shimmered with green. Fields that had been brown and lifeless were now waves of tender shoots. The air was thick with insects, with scents of grass and wildflowers, with warmth that sank deep into bones long chilled. The peasants moved through it all like caretakers of a miracle, aware of how fragile and precious each moment was. They knew that the abundance of summer would soon come, but they also knew that every gift of the earth demanded labor in return at twilight. When the day's work was done, families often sat outside their cottages. They watched the last light fade beyond the hills, the sky turning violet and gold. The sound of crickets began, steady and soothing. Someone might play a slow tune on a flute or hum a hymn. Children dozed against their mothers' shoulders. The peace of the evening was deep and honest, earned by toil, gilded by gratitude. For a little while, they could rest and simply exist within the beauty they had helped coax back into the world. And so spring passed, a season of labor, of renewal, of tender hopes taking root. The peasants knew that summer would soon bring harder days again, harvests, heat, and storms. But for now, they lived in balance between struggle and peace, hunger and fullness, darkness and light. The earth had forgiven them, and they, in turn, forgave the earth. Summer arrived like a deep, slow breath after the long sigh of spring. The world, once gray and shivering, now glowed with warmth and color, so vivid that it seemed almost holy. The fields rippled with tall grain that shimmered like gold beneath the sun, and the peasants moved among them like small, purposeful figures in a vast painting. It was the season of life, of energy, of endless labor beneath a sky so bright it made their eyes water. Yet, even in their exhaustion, there was gratitude. Summer meant abundance. Summer meant survival. The rhythm of their days began before dawn. The cock's crow echoed across the village just as the eastern sky began to pale. Smoke rose from cottage chimneys as women stirred the first fires of the day, setting pots to boil and baking rough loaves of barley bread. Men harnessed the oxen, their breath still visible in the cool morning air, and led them toward the fields. The sound of wooden cartwheels creaking on dirt paths filled the dawn. By sunrise, the village was already alive, humming with movement. The work of summer was endless, but each task had its own quiet dignity. Men mowed hay in the meadows, the scythes. The smell of fresh-cut hay filled the air, sweet, dry, and full of sunlight. Women gathered it into great bundles, stacking them carefully to dry. Children followed behind, laughing and shouting, sometimes tumbling into the piles to hide from one another. There was music in it all, the music of repetition, of human hands working in harmony with the land. When the haying was done, the peasants turned to tending crops, weeding, watering, and watching. That was much of summer's labor. Every stalk of grain mattered, every bean, every cabbage head. Too much rain could rot the roots, too little could parch them. So the peasants read the sky like a sacred text. They knew the look of a storm before the first drop fell, the way the air thickened and darkened, the way the birds grew silent. When thunder rolled in from the hills, they worked faster, racing to gather tools and cover what they could. They feared lightning not only because it could strike their homes, but because it was said to be the anger of God or the mark of a saint's sorrow. When rain came gently, though, they welcomed it. They stood beneath their thatched porches, watching sheets of silver fall across the fields. The smell of wet earth filled the air, and the ground seemed to drink greedily. For a little while, the land rested, and so did they. Then, when the clouds drifted away and sunlight returned, they went back to work, steady, patient, uncomplaining. Food was better now. The hungry days of winter and early spring were only a memory. Gardens were full of beans, onions, and herbs. Milk flowed freely, churned into butter or made into soft cheese. Bread was still coarse but fresh, baked from newly milled flour. On special days, they roasted chickens or shared honey cakes at the tavern. There was ale to drink, cloudy, thick, and slightly sour, brewed from barley and flavored with wild herbs. Each meal, however simple, tasted of reward. Evenings were long and full of sound. After a day in the fields, people gathered outside their cottages, resting on benches or low stone walls. The air was warm and fragrant, carrying the hum of insects and the soft chatter of neighbors. Someone would bring out a fiddle or pipe, and a small circle of dancers would form. Children clapped, elders smiled. It was not celebration in the way of nobles, but it was joy. The quiet kind that grows from survival and shared effort. Summer also brought the yearly fairs, brief, colorful miracles that drew people from miles around. The largest of these might be held in a nearby town, and for a few days the roads filled with travelers. Merchants brought spices, cloth, candles, and charms. Jugglers and musicians performed in the square, their laughter ringing over the crowd. The peasants went in groups, selling what they could: cheese, wool, baskets, honey, and returning with small treasures: a new knife, a colored ribbon, a carved comb. For many, the fair was the only glimpse they had of the wider world, a reminder that life was larger than the fields and forest. There were dangers, too, hidden within the beauty of summer. The sun could burn as cruelly as the frost once bit. A dry spell could turn the earth hard and unyielding, cracking beneath their feet. And sometimes sickness followed heat. Flies bred in the animal pens, carrying fevers that spread through the cottages. When that happened, work slowed, and the priest came again with his cross and his prayers. The people whispered that the saints were testing them, and they endured, just as they had endured the cold. But most days were kind. The light lingered until late evening, stretching the hours of labor, but also of peace. The peasants grew used to the rhythm: wake, work, eat, pray, sleep. Their lives might seem narrow to us now, yet within that small circle there was purpose. Each action had meaning, each moment fit into the great pattern of the year. They did not think of progress or ambition. They thought of continuity, of keeping what their fathers had kept before them. That, to them, was enough. As midsummer approached, the village held another festival, the Feast of St. John. Fires were built on the hilltops, great piles of wood that blazed against the twilight sky. Young people leaped across the flames for luck, while the elders watched and remembered their own youth. The night was filled with song and the smell of burning pine. Some said the fire drove away evil spirits. Others said it strengthened the sun. Whatever the truth, it was beautiful, a night when fear gave way to wonder. And the peasants felt, if only briefly, that they too were part of something vast and shining. The days that followed were the warmest of the year. Work slowed in the afternoons when the heat shimmered across the fields. People sought shade beneath trees or the cool of stone walls. Water from the well tasted sweeter then, and even the oxen stood quietly, tails flicking at flies. Life, for a few short weeks, was almost gentle. The peasants cherished those hours, for they knew what lay ahead. Harvest season was coming, the most demanding and dangerous time of all. As the first grains ripened, the air changed again. The wind through the fields made a soft whisper, like distant applause. The peasants sharpened their sickles and prepared the barns. The Lord's steward rode through the village, reminding them of their duties, which portions of the harvest must be given to the manor, which to the church, and which they could keep. The peasants listened, nodding silently. They knew the rules. They had always known them. Yet each year, as they looked over their fields, they hoped quietly that there would be enough left to fill their own storehouses. Harvest began with prayer. Before the first stalk was cut, the priest blessed the fields again, sprinkling water and reciting words of thanksgiving. Then the work began, long, hot, and relentless. Men and women bent low, swinging their sickles in rhythm, cutting the grain and binding it into sheaves. Children gathered the fallen stalks, stacking them neatly. The air filled with the scent of dry straw and sweat and sunshine. From dawn until dusk, the fields echoed with movement and sound, a human tide rising and falling with the golden waves of grain. At midday, they rested briefly, eating bread and cheese in the shade, washing it down with cool water or ale. Then they worked again until the sun sank low, turning the fields to bronze. When the day finally ended, they trudged home slowly, clothes dusty, hands raw, bodies aching, but hearts content. Each sheaf of grain was a promise that winter would not starve them again. The barns filled, slowly at first, then faster, until they overflowed with the bounty of the earth. When the last bundle was brought in, the village celebrated the harvest feast, perhaps the happiest night of the year. Tables were set outside, fires lit under the stars. There was meat roasting on spits, bread thick with butter, ale poured freely. Songs rose into the dark, songs that told of toil and triumph, of the cycle that bound them to the land and to one another. The oldest drank and smiled, remembering harvests long gone. The youngest danced, their laughter bright as firelight. It was a brief season of joy, earned through sweat and endurance, when at last they lay down to sleep, bellies full and the smell of cut hay still clinging to their hair. The peasants felt a peace deeper than comfort. The world, for now, had been kind. The fields were full, the stores secured, and the stars overhead burned quietly in their endless watch. In that moment, life felt complete, a simple perfection woven from earth, effort, and faith. The celebration of harvest faded slowly, like embers cooling after a fire. The songs that had filled the village nights became quieter, replaced once more by the rustle of wind in the fields and the soft murmur of daily life. The peasants, though weary from their labor, now turned to the next duty that the cycle of the year demanded, and preparing that would carry them safely through the turning of the seasons. For summer, though bright and generous, was never eternal. Already, in the still mornings, the air carried a faint chill. It whispered of autumn. The fields that had once glowed gold now stood bare and pale, their stubble crunching underfoot. After the harvest came gleaning, the final, humble act of gathering the leftover grain that had escaped the sickle. It was often the work of the poorest, widows, children, and the old. With baskets and small knives, they combed the fields carefully, picking up each ear of wheat, each fallen kernel. It was back-breaking work, but sacred in its way, for nothing was wasted. Every handful of grain mattered. Every crumb was a promise against hunger. Men worked to repair tools and fences, sharpening blades, fixing handles, and mending carts. The rhythm of the village slowed, but it did not stop. Women dried herbs, salted meat, and stored vegetables in cellars: carrots, turnips, onions, and cabbages, each carefully packed in straw or sand to last the winter. The smell of earth and smoke filled the air. In the evenings, the cottages glowed softly through their small windows, and the laughter of children drifted through the misty dusk. It was a time of quiet satisfaction, not joy exactly, but a calm awareness that the year's work had been fruitful. The barns were full. The people were tired, but alive. And for medieval peasants, that was enough to call it a good year. As September deepened, the world around them began to change its colors. The leaves along the forest edge turned from green to gold to red, then finally to brown. The sun sank earlier each day, and the mornings grew misty and cool. The scent of apples ripening in the orchards mixed with the earthy smell of fallen leaves. The peasants began the cider making, a ritual as old as memory. Men crushed the apples underfoot or pressed them in wooden vats, while women collected the juice in buckets. It was sweet and cloudy, bubbling with life. Some of it was stored fresh, but most was left to ferment into cider, which would warm them during the dark months ahead. The rhythm of autumn was one of gratitude and farewell. Fields were plowed again, turned over in preparation for next year's sowing. The soil, dark and heavy with moisture, clung to their boots as they worked. It was hard labor, but hopeful labor, an act of faith in the future. Seeds were scattered, prayers were whispered, and the earth received them quietly, like secrets laid to rest beneath a blanket of mist. In these weeks, nature seemed both generous and cruel. Game was plentiful in the woods, deer, boar, and rabbits, but hunting was forbidden to most peasants. The forest, though close, belonged to the Lord. Still, when hunger pressed or a child's cough grew too thin and weak, some risked the shadows, setting snares or venturing out at night. If caught, the punishment could be severe, but desperation often silenced fear. For the poor, survival was both duty and defiance. Life in the village revolved around preparation. Roofs were checked for leaks. Thatch was patched with bundles of straw. The walls of cottages were sealed with new layers of mud and straw to keep the cold from creeping in. Women washed and mended clothing, patching worn wool and replacing frayed ties. Children gathered kindling and firewood, stacking it neatly near the hearth. Each task was small, almost invisible, yet together they formed a shield against the winter to come. Evenings grew darker and colder. Smoke rose from every chimney, curling into the twilight sky like soft gray ribbons. Inside, fires crackled steadily, and shadows danced across the walls. Supper was simple: pottage made from barley and root vegetables, flavored with a pinch of salt or a sprig of thyme. Bread, coarse and brown, was dipped into the thick stew. Sometimes there was cheese, sometimes not. The ale, however, was always present, a comfort as familiar as the fire itself. The people spoke less now. The laughter of summer was replaced by low conversation, stories told in hushed tones, and the gentle rhythm of prayer before sleep. The church bells marked the days, echoing through the cold air like distant reminders of faith and time. Every Sunday, the villagers gathered, not only to worship, but to be together, to see one another's faces and share warmth. The priest spoke of patience and humility, of the turning of God's wheel. The peasants nodded, understanding not through words, but through the lives they lived. By October, the mists grew heavier. The mornings came later, the sun weaker, dew turned to frost, delicate patterns tracing across windows and the tops of fences. The geese were fattened now, ready for slaughter, and their feathers were saved to stuff pillows and bedding. The first fires of true winter were lit, and a familiar scent returned to the air, wood smoke, mingled with the faint sweetness of drying apples and herbs. The season of endurance had come again, and yet there was beauty even in this fading world. The forest glowed with colors like old gold and rusted bronze. The rivers moved slower, reflecting the dim sky like glass. The sound of wind in the trees was softer now, a kind of whispering song that lulled both the weary and the watchful. The peasants, though simple in speech, often paused to listen to these things. They did not call it poetry, but it was the quiet poetry of survival. As the last leaves fell, the festivals of autumn began. The feast of All Saints, then All Souls' Day, times to remember the dead, to light candles for those who had gone before. The villagers walked to the church, carrying small lanterns, their breath white in the cold air. Inside, the light of 100 flames flickered across stone walls. The priest's voice echoed, solemn and low, speaking of eternity, of the souls of fathers and mothers resting in peace. Outside, the night was silent, and frost gathered on the graves. It was both sorrowful and comforting, a reminder that the living and the dead shared the same circle of time. After these holy days came Martinmas, the feast of Saint Martin. It was the final celebration before the long sleep of winter. On that day, the last animals were slaughtered, the meat salted or smoked for storage. There was feasting and laughter, though beneath it lay the knowledge that the world was about to turn cold and still again. People sang songs of harvest and faith, drinking cider and ale until the fires burned low. And when, at last, the revelry faded, they went home through the frost. Hearts warm, but minds aware. Soon, the snow would come. As November deepened, the first flakes fell delicate, uncertain at first, then thicker, more determined. The roofs turned white, the roads vanished beneath a soft blanket. Smoke rose in steady plumes from the cottages, and the sound of the world grew muffled and slow. Inside, the peasants drew closer to their hearths, listening to the wind howl through the cracks. The cycle had turned again, as it always did. They had survived one more harvest, one more year, and now they would wait once more for the return of light. But even in waiting, there was purpose. The men repaired harnesses and tools, carved handles, or made small wooden toys. The women spun wool into thread, their fingers moving steadily, while children slept nearby. The old told stories of summers long past, of strange omens and saints' miracles, of kings and wars that felt impossibly far away. The stories mixed truth and imagination until no one could tell them apart. It did not matter. What mattered was the telling, the keeping of memory alive through the long, dark nights. The peasants did not think of history as we do now. To them, time was not a line, but a circle. Each year repeated the one before it, the same struggles, the same small joys. Yet within that sameness was a quiet, enduring peace. They had no grand ambitions, no wealth or fame. Their triumph was in endurance. their meaning found in the rhythm of work, rest, and faith. And so, as the snow fell outside and the firelight flickered within, the medieval peasants closed another chapter of their endless story. A story written not in ink, but in sweat and soil and prayer. Winter arrived, not with a roar, but with a slow, quiet breath, a whisper that crept through the bare branches and the cracks in the old wooden doors. At first, the peasants thought it might pass quickly, as it sometimes did. But then came the long frost, the kind that hardened the rivers and silenced the earth. The fields turned pale under a skin of snow. The sky hung low and gray, pressing down upon the village like a heavy woolen blanket. The world seemed to fall asleep, and so, in a way, did time. For the medieval peasant, winter was not only a season, it was a test of endurance, patience, and faith. It stripped life down to its simplest truths: warmth, food, and the will to continue. The work of summer and autumn had all been in preparation for this. The long stretch of darkness when the sun barely touched the horizon and every day felt like twilight. The people of the village, their hands calloused and faces weathered by years of wind and toil, drew inward, both in body and in spirit. The cottages became small worlds unto themselves. Smoke rose from every thatch-roofed home, curling through the air like fragile threads against the cold. Inside the hearth was everything, a flickering heart of orange and gold. The fire was not simply a source of heat, it was life. The peasants gathered around it each morning and each night, feeding it carefully, whispering thanks when it caught the logs and burned steady. Children played near it, their cheeks red from the warmth, while the old sat close, wrapped in woolen cloaks, staring into the flames as though they might see the future. Their wood was precious now. The men rationed it carefully, knowing that each piece burned meant one less for the coming weeks. When the wind howled outside and the snow piled against the doors, they thanked the foresight of autumn, the endless days spent chopping, stacking, and drying the firewood that now kept them alive. Sometimes, in the harshest storms, they burned dried peat or even old straw, anything to keep the fire from dying. The thought of a cold hearth was enough to stir fear in even the bravest heart. Food, too, became a slow arithmetic of survival. The stores in the cellar, salted meat, grain, dried beans, and root vegetables had to last until the first thaw. Each day was measured in portions. A pot of pottage simmered endlessly over the fire, thickening as the week went on, flavored with whatever could be spared. A bone for broth, a handful of herbs, sometimes a sliver of bacon. Bread was baked less often now, and the loaves were smaller. Yet even the simplest meal, shared around the fire, carried a kind of sacred comfort. Outside, the world had gone silent. The animals, too, seemed to vanish into stillness. The oxen were sheltered in the barns, the sheep huddled together under the low roofs, their breath steaming in the cold. The dogs curled by the doors, their ears twitching at every sound in the night. The chickens roosted quietly, feathers puffed for warmth. The peasants checked on them daily, careful not to waste a single egg or drop of milk. In a season when nothing grew, every living creature became part of the fragile balance that held the village together. The days were short and dim. The sun, when it appeared, hung low in the sky, casting long blue shadows across the snow. By mid-afternoon, the light began to fade again, and the world slipped back into dusk. the peasants rose and slept with the rhythm of the sun, their bodies following the slow pulse of the earth itself. There was no hurry, no rush, only the quiet passage of time, marked by the crackle of fire and the sigh of the wind. In those long nights, stories became the warmth of the soul. The old told tales of saints and miracles, of wolves in the forest and kings who ruled in distant lands. The children listened wide-eyed, their faces glowing in the firelight. Sometimes, when the wind moaned through the trees, the peasants crossed themselves, whispering that spirits walked abroad in such weather, the souls of the restless dead, or the folk wandering unseen. They hung small charms above their doors and placed iron nails in the corners of their homes to ward off evil. Fear and faith were neighbors in those days, living side by side in the same small room. When the storms passed, there came a strange beauty in their wake. The world sparkled with frost, every branch and fence post coated in white crystals that caught the faint sunlight. The snow muffled every sound, so that footsteps seemed to echo softly into nothingness. The peasants ventured out to fetch water or feed the animals, their breath rising in clouds before them. Their boots crunched in the snow, and the sound was the only sign of life for miles around. Yet, in that stillness, there was peace, the deep, clean peace of a world at rest. Winter Sundays held a special gravity. The villagers walked to church through the snow, wrapped in cloaks and hoods, their boots damp, their faces pale from the cold. The church bell tolled slowly, its sound rolling over the frozen fields. Inside, the air was bitter, but the candles burned bright. The priest spoke of endurance, of Christ's suffering, and the promise of spring. The peasants listened, heads bowed, their breath forming a faint mist that rose like prayer. When they sang, their voices echoed against the stone, thin but strong. For a moment, they felt the warmth of something larger than fire, the warmth of hope. The poorest among them fared the hardest. Some cottages had little wood, little food. Neighbors helped when they could, sharing what they had. The church sometimes gave alms, a loaf of bread, a cup of ale, a few sticks for burning. Yet hunger was a constant companion. There were days when the air inside the cottages grew heavy and still, when no laughter came, and only the crackling of the fire broke the silence. But the peasants did not despair easily. They had seen too many winters to think this one would last forever. Even in the coldest months, life continued. Women spun wool, their spindles turning slowly as they talked. Men mended tools, carved handles, or wove baskets from willow. Children learned small chores, fetching water, sweeping floors, helping tend the animals. The rhythm of work kept the mind steady. The peasants understood that idleness was a kind of danger, not just to the body, but to the spirit. As long as their hands were busy, the long nights could not swallow them whole. On rare, clear days, when the sun shone on the frozen fields, the village seemed almost cheerful. The snow glittered, and the sky turned pale blue. The peasants took such days as blessings, going out to chop more wood or mend fences broken by the wind. The children played, sliding on frozen ponds, their laughter echoing across the empty countryside. It was fleeting, but it was joy nonetheless, a reminder that life persisted even in the hardest times. Then there were the nights of deep cold, when the fire seemed too small to fight the dark. The wind pressed against the walls like a living thing, and the snow hissed against the shutters. the peasants huddled close, wrapping themselves in blankets and furs. The sound of the storm became a kind of lullaby, fierce, steady, endless. It was frightening, yet familiar. They whispered prayers to Saint Nicholas, the patron of travelers, and to the Virgin, asking for mercy and warmth. And somehow, through faith and fire, they endured. The turning point of winter came with Christmas, the feast of hope. For peasants, it was not the grand affair of nobles, but it was sacred all the same. The church was decorated with evergreen branches, symbols of eternal life. Candles flickered on the altar, casting golden light on the stone walls. After the Mass, the villagers returned home to share what little they could, a loaf of fresh bread, perhaps a piece of meat saved for the occasion. There was singing and laughter, and for a moment, the cold outside seemed to vanish. Children received small gifts, an apple, a carved toy, a ribbon. Even the poorest smiled. For Christmas was the promise that light would return. As the new year approached, the peasants marked its coming with quiet reflection rather than celebration. They gathered again at the church, praying for a kind year, for health, and for mercy. The priest sprinkled holy water on their heads, blessing them for the seasons to come. Outside, the snow fell softly, covering the graves in the churchyard, the fields, and the roads alike. The peasants walked home slowly, their footprints fading behind them in the white. And so winter continued, week after week, until even the cold seemed to grow tired. The days lengthened almost imperceptibly. The sun lingered a few moments longer on the horizon. Icicles dripped. The sound of water returned, faint but sure, whispering beneath the ice. The peasants noticed first in the animals, a restless stirring, a hint of change. The hens began to lay again. The cows gave more milk. The air smelled different somehow, a touch softer, as though the world were stretching its limbs after a long sleep. The peasants did not speak of it yet. They knew better than to trust the first signs of spring. But in their hearts, the thought took root, the thought of warmth, of green fields, of life returning. And as they sat by their fires, staring into the embers, they dreamed quietly of the thaw to come. When the faintest blush of dawn touched the thatched rooftops of the medieval village, a strange sense of relief mixed with exhaustion filled the air. Winter's cruel grasp was slowly loosening, and yet the peasants knew that spring did not arrive overnight. It came timidly, like a shy guest, one hesitant step at a time. Each morning still carried a bite of frost. Each evening still demanded the crackling of a hearth. But deep inside, the villagers began to sense the turning of the earth to warmth. The peasants had learned, over generations, to read nature's smallest signs. The way the crows returned earlier to their nests, the sudden drip of thawing icicles, or the quiet murmur of water beneath the frozen stream. These were not just sounds, but promises. Promises that soon they would no longer wake to the painful stiffness of frozen joints, or to the fear that their dwindling food stores might not last another week. Hope, however small, began to flutter in their chests. In the cottages, smoke no longer rose all day long. The need for constant fire had passed. The peasants would now ration their remaining firewood carefully, saving what little was left for nights that still chilled the bones. The women started airing out the straw bedding, shaking off months of soot and dampness. Children, pale and thin after the long winter, were sent outside to play near the edge of the fields, where the first patches of thawed soil appeared. They laughed, their voices carrying over the quiet land like a long-forgotten song. For the first time in months, the village felt alive again. The men, though weary from a season of endurance, turned their attention to the fields. The frozen ground was slowly softening under the hesitant sun, and it was time to begin the ritual of rebirth. With crude wooden plows and oxen that had barely survived the winter, they broke the ground open, letting the cold air carry away the mold and decay that had settled in the soil. Their hands, rough and scarred, gripped the plow handles with determination. They knew that if the first sowing failed, the coming months would bring hunger again. There was no margin for error. Each swing of the tool, each step in the thawing mud, was a prayer, silent, desperate, but filled with faith. In their minds, they whispered to the earth, "Please, let this year be kind." At night, when the village gathered again around smaller fires, talk shifted from survival to hope. They spoke of planting barley and rye, of maybe raising an extra pig if the harvest went well. Mothers mended clothes with brighter patches of fabric. Fathers carved small wooden toys for their children. The fear that had ruled them for months now lingered like an old shadow but for the first time. It did not dominate them. Still, the cold had not yet fully retreated. On some nights, the wind returned, cruel and sharp, sweeping down from the hills. When that happened, the peasants retreated into their cottages, wrapping themselves in old habits. They sealed cracks with mud and cloth. They burned what little wood they had left, and they whispered stories of winters long past of ancestors who had survived worse. Old Marin, the village storyteller, often spoke of the winter of the wolves, when the snow had buried entire hamlets and people vanished into the white. Her voice, low and rhythmic, filled the smoky rooms as children huddled close to their mothers. The stories weren't meant to frighten, they were meant to remind everyone that endurance was not new, it was part of who they were. Survival wasn't luck, it was inheritance. When the wind howled through the cracks, Marin would pause, letting the sound echo like a ghost's sigh, and then she'd smile faintly. "Listen," she'd say, "that's winter leaving. It growls as it goes." As the days lengthened, the snow receded like an old enemy, retreating into the hills. The peasants followed its disappearance with quiet satisfaction. They watched as rivulets of melting snow filled the streams and ponds, turning the brown earth into rich, dark mud. To them, that mud was golded. Even the smell of the wet ground felt like life returning. The village blacksmith, who had spent most of the winter repairing farm tools in exchange for bread or ale, now worked feverishly. Plow blades needed sharpening, horseshoes reforging, buckets mending. His forge glowed brighter each day, its smoke curling into the soft blue sky. Around him, the clanging of metal became the anthem of spring's arrival. The peasants came to his shop with tired faces but lighter hearts, each one knowing that the work they did now would shape the rest of the year. And as the world softened, so did the people. Harsh tempers eased. Quarrels from the winter-born, from hunger and cold, were forgotten or forgiven. They shared small kindnesses again: a loaf of bread, a bundle of herbs, a helping hand in the fields. The long freeze had reminded them that survival was never a solitary act, it was always a collective one. By mid-season, the sun hung longer in the sky, painting everything in gentle warmth. Children ran barefoot through puddles, chasing the last patches of snow. Women knelt in the fields beside the men, sowing seeds in rhythmic silence. The sound of the wind had changed, no longer hissed and bit, but rustled through the budding branches with a softer whisper at night. The peasants lay under thinner blankets and listened to the quiet hum of insects returning to life. It was the sound of promise, of continuation, of another year turning in the endless wheel of time as they drifted to sleep. The thought that carried them through the final edge of winter was simple, almost sacred. We have made it through once more. When the faintest blush of dawn touched the thatched rooftops of the medieval village, a strange sense of relief mixed with exhaustion filled the air. Winter's cruel grasp was slowly loosening, and yet the peasants knew that spring did not arrive overnight. It came timidly, like a shy guest, one hesitant step at a time. Each morning still carried a bite of frost. Each evening still demanded the crackling of a hearth. But deep inside, the villagers began to sense the turning of the earth to warmth. The peasants had learned, over generations, to read nature's smallest signs. The way the crows returned earlier to their nests, the sudden drip of thawing icicles, or the quiet murmur of water beneath the frozen stream. These were not just sounds, but promises. Promises that soon they would no longer wake to the painful stiffness of frozen joints, or to the fear that their dwindling food stores might not last another week. Hope, however small, began to flutter in their chests. In the cottages, smoke no longer rose all day long. The need for constant fire had passed. The peasants would now ration their remaining firewood carefully, saving what little was left for nights that still chilled the bones. The women started airing out the straw bedding, shaking off months of soot and dampness. Children, pale and thin after the long winter, were sent outside to play near the edge of the fields, where the first patches of thawed soil appeared. They laughed, their voices carrying over the quiet land like a long-forgotten song. For the first time in months, the village felt alive again. The men, though weary from a season of endurance, turned their attention to the fields. The frozen ground was slowly softening under the hesitant sun, and it was time to begin the ritual of rebirth. With crude wooden plows and oxen that had barely survived the winter, they broke the ground open, letting the cold air carry away the mold and decay that had settled in the soil. Their hands, rough and scarred, gripped the plow handles with determination. They knew that if the first sowing failed, the coming months would bring hunger again. There was no margin for error. Each swing of the tool, each step in the thawing mud, was a prayer, silent, desperate, but filled with faith. In their minds, they whispered to the earth, "Please, let this year be kind." At night, when the village gathered again around smaller fires, talk shifted from survival to hope. They spoke of planting barley and rye, of maybe raising an extra pig if the harvest went well. Mothers mended clothes with brighter patches of fabric. Fathers carved small wooden toys for their children. The fear that had ruled them for months now lingered like an old shadow, but for the first time, it did not dominate them. Still, the cold had not yet fully retreated. On some nights, the wind returned, cruel and sharp, sweeping down from the hills. When that happened, the peasants retreated into their cottages, wrapping themselves in old habits. They sealed cracks with mud and cloth. They burned what little wood they had left. And they whispered stories of winters long past of ancestors who had survived worse. Old Marin, the village storyteller, often spoke of the winter of the wolves, when the snow had buried entire hamlets and people vanished into the white. Her voice, low and rhythmic, filled the smoky rooms as children huddled close to their mothers. The stories weren't meant to frighten. They were meant to remind everyone that endurance was not new, it was part of who they were. Survival wasn't luck, it was inheritance. When the wind howled through the cracks, Marin would pause, letting the sound echo like a ghost's sigh, and then she'd smile faintly. "Listen," she'd say, "that's winter leaving. It growls as it goes." As the days lengthened, the snow receded, like an old enemy retreating into the hills. The peasants followed its disappearance with quiet satisfaction. They watched as rivulets of melting snow filled the streams and ponds, turning the brown earth into rich, dark mud. To them, that mud was gold. It meant planting, it meant renewal. Even the smell of the wet ground felt like life returning. The village blacksmith, who had spent most of the winter repairing farm tools in exchange for bread or ale, now worked feverishly. Plow blades needed sharpening, horseshoes reforging, buckets mending. His forge glowed brighter each day, its smoke curling into the soft blue sky. Around him, the clanging of metal became the anthem of spring's arrival. The peasants came to his shop with tired faces but lighter hearts, each one knowing that the work they did now would shape the rest of the year. And as the world softened, so did the people. Harsh tempers eased. Quarrels from the winter born from hunger and cold were forgotten or forgiven. They shared small kindnesses again. A loaf of bread, a bundle of herbs, a helping hand in the fields. The long freeze had reminded them that survival was never a solitary act, was always a collective one. By mid-season, the sun hung longer in the sky, painting everything in gentle warmth. Children ran barefoot through puddles, chasing the last patches of snow. Women knelt in the fields beside the men, sowing seeds in rhythmic silence. The sound of the wind had changed, no longer hissed and bit, but rustled through the budding branches with a softer whisper. At night, the peasants lay under thinner blankets and listened to the quiet hum of insects returning to life. It was the sound of promise, of continuation, of another year turning in as twilight spread its soft, violet hues over the quiet medieval village. The air carried a different kind of chill, gentler, forgiving, almost tender. The long, merciless winter had finally begun to surrender. And though the nights still nipped at the skin, the peasants could sense warmth hidden somewhere just beneath the soil. It was as if the earth itself was slowly waking from a deep sleep. Inside their small cottages, the peasants no longer crowded around the hearth in silent fear of frost. Instead, they sat quietly, their faces lit by the dim orange glow of small fires that burned not for survival now, but for comfort. The women mended worn clothes with steadier hands, humming low songs from their mother's time. Men cleaned their tools, scraping away the rust of neglect, as if cleansing the past months of cold and darkness from their lives. The children, freed from the long confinement of icy days, played outside until dusk, laughing at the strange softness of the thawing ground beneath their bare feet. The laughter sounded foreign at first, as though the village had forgotten what joy felt like, but it returned easily. carried on the wind that smelled faintly of wet grass and wood smoke. For the first time in months, the sound of laughter echoed across the fields again. The village was breathing. The peasants could finally rest without counting the days until another storm arrived. The cold still lingered at night, creeping into corners and under doors, but it no longer carried the same threat. Instead, it was a reminder of what they had survived. In the stillness of the night, when the fire crackled low and the world outside shimmered under a blanket of pale mist, they would lie awake and listen to the frogs calling from the marsh and the rustling of mice beneath the floorboards. The noises of life, once muted by the thick snow, had returned, and that to them was a lullaby sweeter than any song. The old healer, Father Thane, would walk the muddy paths each morning with his basket of herbs. Nodding to those he passed, his tired face split into a rare smile. He had lost too many patients that winter, and yet he knew he was one of the lucky ones, spared to see the land live again. He collected early shoots of mint and nettle, whispering small blessings as he cut them. The villagers believed his murmurs kept the plants alive, but Thane knew the truth. It was gratitude that made them grow. Gratitude for the light returning, for the steady drip of melted snow, for the sound of the river flowing again. As the peasants worked the fields, their plows slicing through the damp soil, they felt that same quiet thankfulness in their bones. It wasn't joy, not yet joy, was a luxury they had long forgotten, but it was peace. Simple, honest peace. At night, when the fields turned silver beneath the moon, they would sit outside on wooden stools, wrapped in cloaks and old blankets, sharing mugs of thin ale. The conversations were soft and slow. They spoke of small things, a cow giving birth to a calf, the return of a flock of birds, a dream someone had about green hills and sunlight. These weren't grand stories, but they were sacred to them. They were proof that the world went on. Even the old church bell, silent through the frozen months, was rung again one morning when the priest decided to hold a service of thanks. The sound traveled over the roofs, carried by the gentle wind, and people stopped in their work to listen. It was not a loud or solemn ring, it was soft, almost shy, like the first voice of spring, calling out to remind everyone they had survived. Inside the church, the candles burned weakly at first, their flames trembling in the draught, but soon they steadied, glowing against the wooden walls like tiny suns. Father Alden spoke not of sin or punishment, but of endurance. He said, "The cold tests our flesh, but it also tempers our spirit." His voice was warm, and the people believed him because they had lived it. When the service ended, no one wanted to leave. They lingered, exchanging stories, their words weaving a tapestry of shared memory. Even those who had lost the most managed to smile. Outside, the air was bright and clean, the sky stretching endlessly above them, endless wheel of time as they drifted to sleep. The thought that carried them through the final edge of winter was simple, almost sacred. We have made it through once more. When the first true warmth of summer began to brush the air, the medieval village transformed in ways that felt almost magical to those who had endured the coldest nights of winter. The land that once lay buried beneath hard ice and silence now burst into color and sound. The hum of bees, the distant croak of frogs, the rustle of leaves heavy with new life. The peasants, those same tired souls who once shivered in the dark corners of their cottages, now walked barefoot through the fields, their feet sinking into the soft earth that pulsed with warmth. Every day began with birdsong and ended with the golden glow of a sun that lingered long past supper. The air itself smelled alive, carrying the sweet scent of wildflowers and freshly turned soil. It was as if the world had forgiven them for surviving the winter. In the early mornings, mist still curled over the riverbanks, and the peasants would rise before dawn to begin their work. Their movements were slower now, not from weakness, but from reverence. Each act pulling a weed, filling a bucket, tying a bundle of herbs felt sacred. Life had returned, and they handled it gently. The fields that had once been barren now shimmered with shoots of barley and rye, their soft green blades swaying under the gentle breeze. The oxen, once gaunt and weary, were strong again, pulling the plows with steady determination. The women, whose hands had cracked and bled in the cold, now glowed with sunburn and purpose as they hung linens in the wind or gathered wild berries in the woods. Laughter became a daily sound again. It floated from the fields and along the dirt paths where children chased each other with sticks and wooden hoops. The rhythm of life had returned, and it was slow, simple, and deeply human. In the heart of the village, the blacksmith's forge sang with the sound of hammer on metal. Sparks flew into the warm air like tiny fireflies, and his rhythmic strikes became the heartbeat of the settlement. The smell of iron and smoke mixed with the sweetness of hay and bread baking in ovens, creating a scent that was both earthy and comforting. It was in these small things, the smell, the sound, the texture of the day, that the peasants found joy. They didn't speak of happiness, not in grand words, but they lived it quietly in every gesture. Evenings were a gift. After long hours in the fields, the peasants would gather by the stream that cut through the edge of the village. They washed their faces and feet in the cool water, their reflections shimmering under the last light of the sun. They talked in low tones, not out of sadness, but because peace made them soft-spoken. The old men told tales of summers long gone, of good harvests and bad, of storms that had come without warning and feasts that had followed after. The young listened, learning that life was not a straight road, but a circle. Winter would always return, but so would the spring, and knowing that brought comfort, not fear. The nights grew warmer, filled with the hum of crickets and the scent of blooming flowers. The villagers left their windows open to the cool air, and the soft glow of their candles flickered like stars through the village. Sleep came easily now. There was no hunger twisting their stomachs, no cold biting at their toes. They dreamed of harvests heavy with grain, of songs by the fire, of the next morning's work. To outsiders, their lives might have seemed hard and plain, but to them, this quiet existence was perfection. Each moment was a small victory, a reminder that they were still part of the great turning of the world. As midsummer approached, the peasants prepared for the festival of the Suna tradition, older than memory. For days, they gathered flowers, baked bread, brewed ale, and cleaned the paths that wound through the village. On the night of the celebration, they built a great fire in the meadow. Its flames reached high into the twilight, sparks rising to meet the first stars. The entire village came together, old and young, strong and weak, all bound by the same invisible thread of survival. The priest blessed the gathering, but his words were drowned by the singing that followed. Hands joined, Feet danced upon the soft earth, and the air filled with the sound of joy. For that night, no one remembered hunger or fear. They were simply alive beneath the wide, forgiving sky. Children leaped through the smaller fires, laughing as the sparks kissed their clothes. Lovers stole away into the tall grass. The old sat near the edges, watching with eyes that had seen too much and still found beauty. When the moon climbed high and the fire burned low, the villagers lay on their backs, staring at the stars. No one spoke. There was no need. The silence was thick with gratitude. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere in that vast quiet, they felt a truth that words could never capture. That life, fragile and fleeting as it was still worth every hardship. It was not just survival, it was belonging. And as the fire's last embers glowed against the dark, each of them carried that warmth within, a spark that would see them through whatever came next. When morning came, the fields shimmered with dew, and the world felt freshly made. The peasants rose with sore bodies but light hearts. Another season had begun, and with it the promise of days filled with labor, laughter, and the simple grace of being alive. The days that followed the midsummer fire were rich with warmth and rhythm, each one blending softly into the next, until time itself seemed to melt like butter under the sun. This was the season of plenty, when the earth gave back what it had taken, and the fields swelled with promise. Every dawn began in gold, the kind of light that soaked into everything, turning even the simplest things beautiful. The curve of a plow, the steam rising from fresh bread, the laughter that echoed from the well. Peasants woke before the rooster's cry, their faces lined but peaceful, their bodies weary yet grateful. The winter had tested them, but now the world seemed to apologize for its cruelty with every ripe berry, every stalk heavy with grain. The mornings began with the soft rustle of linen dresses and the thud of wooden buckets. Men and women walked to the fields side by side, the air alive with the hum of bees and the sweet perfume of clover. The earth was soft beneath their bare feet, cool with dew, and alive with tiny creatures stirring in the soil. The peasants worked slowly, not because they were lazy, but because they knew that haste had no place in a world governed by seasons. Everything grew in its own time, and they had learned to move with that rhythm, not against it. The sound of scythes cutting through tall grass echoed across the valley, joined by the laughter of children chasing grasshoppers between rows of barley. There was no hurry, no shouting, just the steady, ancient music of work done by hand. In the shade of a great oak, the women sat weaving garlands from wildflowers, their fingers quick and sure. The smell of baking bread drifted from the cottages, mixing with the scent of cut hay. Even the animals seemed content. The cows flicked their tails lazily, and the chickens strutted through the dust, their feathers shining in the sun. At midday, the villagers paused. The fields shimmered in the heat, and a silver haze danced above the soil. Lunch was simple black bread, cheese, onions, and sometimes a bit of salt pork butt eaten together under the wide sky. It felt like a feast. They drank from wooden cups filled with cool water drawn from the well, and some took a brief nap under the trees, their hats tilted over their eyes. In those small hours, the world seemed utterly still, as if time itself bowed in reverence to the fullness of life. When the shadows grew long again, work resumed until the sun dipped low and the sky turned a soft rose. The peasants walked home in quiet groups, their tools slung over their shoulders, their feet dusty but their hearts light. In the village, smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and the smell of stew filled the air. The women hummed softly as they stirred pots over open flames, and the men mended tools by candlelight. Children played with sticks and stones, inventing kingdoms no one else could see. As night fell, the air cooled, and stars began to scatter across the sky. Crickets sang, dogs barked, and somewhere a flute played a slow, winding tune. The villagers gathered outside their cottages, talking in low tones, sometimes singing. They didn't speak of history or kings or wars. Those were for other people. Their world was here, small and sacred, bounded by fields and seasons, by love and loss and laughter. When the moon rose, pale and full, they looked up at it, not as something distant and divine, but as an old friend that had watched over their ancestors too. Life felt eternal in those moments. Days became weeks, and the harvest grew heavy. The peasants worked longer hours now, but the air was filled with joy. The barns began to fill with sheaves of wheat and rye, the fruits of months of labor. The sound of flails beating grain echoed through the evenings, and the whole village smelled of straw and smoke. There was music everywhere, in the creak of wagon wheels, in the splash of water over stones, in the rhythm of breathing as people rested on doorsteps, watching the sunset fade. It was not a grand life, but it was full in a way few would ever understand. When the last bundle was tied and stored, the harvest feast began. Tables were laid with bread, cheese, apples, and ale. The air rang with laughter and song, and for one night, no one thought of the cold or hunger that would one day return. They ate until their bellies were full and danced until the stars blurred above them. The children fell asleep in the grass, and the old people watched them with eyes full of quiet pride. The world, for now, was kind, and as the fires burned low and the night wrapped around the village, a gentle peace settled over all. Tomorrow would bring work. Again, there was always work, but for this night, they rested in the soft glow of abundance, thankful for the fragile, fleeting beauty of the season of plenty. As the golden days of summer began to fade, a subtle change swept across the medieval countryside, one so gentle that it could almost go unnoticed. The mornings grew cooler, the air thinner, and the scent of ripened fruit mingled with the faint, earthy smell of leaves beginning to dry. The sun still rose bright and strong, but its light had softened. It no longer burned, it glowed. Shadows lengthened over the fields, stretching lazily as if the land itself were preparing for rest. The peasants, who had spent months in the open air beneath the relentless heat, now welcomed the cool breeze that whispered through the trees. It carried with it the promise of rest, but also a quiet warning. Another winter was on its way. Life in the village slowed, not from idleness, but from reverence for the season's balance. The fields, stripped of their grain, now stood bare, except for patches of stubble that rustled in the wind. The peasants worked to gather what remained: turnips, onions, cabbages, and stored them carefully in root cellars, dug deep beneath their cottages. The smell of earth filled their nostrils as they packed straw over the vegetables to keep them fresh through the long, frozen nights ahead. Every task was done with care and patience. The women dried herbs by hanging them in bunches from the rafters, their colors fading slowly from green to brown. Apples were strung on twine and hung near the fire to dry, and the air inside the cottages smelled sweet and smoky. The men repaired the thatch on roofs, patched holes in walls, and chopped firewood until great piles stood beside every door like silent guardians against the cold to come. Evenings came sooner now. The sky blushed early, the clouds turning from gold to rose to violet, and the first stars appeared before the last songs of the birds had ended. The peasants would pause their work to watch the sun sink beyond the distant hills, grateful for one more day of light. When darkness settled, they gathered indoors, the glow of the hearth painting their faces in soft amber. Outside, the wind began to whisper. Differently, it no longer carried warmth, but a cool bite that made them pull their shawls tighter. Inside the cottages, however, there was comfort. The hearth became the heart of the home again. Its fire cracked and hissed, throwing sparks that danced like tiny stars. Around it, families ate thick stews made from the last of the fresh vegetables, bread baked dark and heavy, and sometimes a bit of meat saved from the hunt. The children listened to the old stories of spirits that wandered the autumn woods, of ancient kings and long-lost loves. Their eyes grew wide, but the fear was sweet, the kind that belonged to safe places and warm fires. Outside, the night deepened, and the moon rose high and pale, shining through the bare branches. It was in these moments that the peasants felt closest to the land, not in the abundance of summer, but in the quiet preparation of autumn. They understood that life was a cycle of giving and taking, of birth and death and rebirth again. To survive was not to fight the seasons, but to move with them, to listen to their language. The wind spoke differently now, telling them that the frost was not far off. They watched the birds begin to gather and fly south, their dark shapes crossing the fading sky like brushstrokes on a painting. The forests turned to fire leaves, shifting from green to gold, then crimson, then brown. Children played in the falling leaves, their laughter echoing through the trees, unaware of the symbolism their joy carried. The elders, however, knew. They watched with quiet eyes, remembering all the autumns before and the winters that had followed. There was peace in that knowledge. When the harvest festival arrived, it was quieter than the one in summer, but somehow more sacred. The villagers gathered once more, this time around smaller fires, dressed in their warmest cloaks. They offered thanks to the earth for its gifts, baskets of apples, loaves of bread, a jug of ale brewed from the last of the barley. The priest's voice rose in prayer, but the real holiness was in the silence that followed. They ate slowly, savoring every bite. It was not celebration as much as reflection, a moment to breathe before the long sleep of winter began. When the fire burned low and the stars turned cold above them, the peasants walked home under the pale light of the moon. Their breath rose in thin clouds, and their footsteps crunched softly on the frost-tipped grass. Behind them, the village lay still, smoke curling from chimneys, windows glowing faintly like fireflies in the dark. Inside their cottages, they pulled the shutters closed, banked the fire, and slipped under heavy blankets. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees, and the first thin veil of frost spread over the fields. Another year was turning, and the world was preparing to sleep. Yet within that sleep, life waited, quiet, patient, and eternal. For every ending, the peasants knew, was simply the beginning of another story whispered by the earth.